Hey everyone, this week we are going to look at a variety of discrimination laws. So far in the class this semester, we've already looked at a handful of discrimination based laws, going all the way back to our unit on constitutional law when we examined the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. Recently, we spent some time examining some gender equity laws. So we looked specifically at Title IX and the Equal Pay Act. So this conversation that we're having this week is really an extension of those conversations, but now we're going to focus more broadly on some statutory laws, some federally legislated policies that deal with discrimination. So we're going to examine the Civil Rights Act, specifically Title VII of the Civil Rights Act that deals with employment discrimination. We're going to examine the different types of sexual harassment in the workplace. And then finally, we're going to look at the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, and again, try to tie these things to K&R and what we're doing in this field. And there are several examples that are, I think, both relevant and current that we can look to. Okay, so just a little bit of history here on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Just knowing the history of this country and the timing of when this law passed, you can probably already sort of, gauge the vibe of what's going on at the time. And, we've already talked a little bit about this time in the mid to late 60s when we talked about our unit on gender equity and how there was really a shift in society where women for the first time were saying, this is something we want to see change on. And really, as that women's rights movement is gaining speed, so is this civil rights movement. Unfortunately, at the time, we still had a lot of discrimination based on race in this country. And so, I've given you kind of several examples here of some of the things that the Civil Rights Act worked to try to make better, right? So there was still discrimination in terms of voter registration requirements. Black Americans weren't able to get registered to vote at the same levels that white Americans were. Unfortunately, we still have some remnants of that today. Education access was a major issue, especially in regards to segregation. Housing, there was a lot of discrimination in terms of banks giving loans to Black Americans and also realtors and whether or not they would actually show houses to Black Americans. And then finally, this issue of employment. Certainly, there was still discrimination based on race happening in employment settings all across America at the time. So bring in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is a massive bill, a massive piece of legislation that seeks out to essentially rid discrimination in these various aspects of our society. And really, at the heart of it, this bill was put in place initially to deal with racial discrimination. But as you'll see, the intended meaning of the law expands over time to cover other groups as well, and we'll talk more about that later. But keep in mind, the Civil Rights Act is a massive bill. It includes several different pieces and titles, more specifically. The title we're going to focus on is Title VII, because it specifically deals with employment discrimination. Okay, so that will be the focus of our first video here this week. Okay, so just a little bit of kind of background in terms of who actually has to comply with Title VII. So you can see here it applies to employers with 15 or more employees. So you can see already that this bill has pretty broad application in this country, right? Far more so than, say, the Equal Protection Clause, right? Because we know that only applied to state actors. Well, Title VII is applying to any business that employs 15 or more people. So you can see that that's already much more broad in terms of application. It also applies to labor organizations and government agencies. So they also have to comply with Title VII. And then in terms of how a Title VII lawsuit can be filed, you can see there's a couple different avenues here. So, kind of the traditional route is individual who believes they've been discriminated against under Title VII files a lawsuit against a specific individual or a company. So that's kind of the traditional route. Another option, though, is we have this EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission here in the US, and one of their roles is to potentially file cases on behalf of a plaintiff. So, we see this occasionally where the EEOC will get involved, the plaintiff will write to them, they see it as a case that's worth pursuing, and they may take on the legal work on behalf of that plaintiff to bring the case. All right, so I already mentioned that Title VII in particular deals with employment-based discrimination, right? And we know that the original law, the Civil Rights Act itself, was put in place to deal with these issues of racial discrimination. So certainly that's one of the protected classes that we're dealing with when we look at Title VII. But as I mentioned earlier, the law itself has really been expanded over the years to cover other groups of marginalized individuals. And you can see that here, right? So these are, through prior case court decisions, precedents, that we also include discrimination based on national origin, discrimination based on religion, and discrimination based on gender or sex. So you can see that the law itself has expanded to cover a lot of different groups over time. One of the more interesting expansions here falls under the gender sex category. So you can see a couple of specific groups that have been added to the coverage here. In 1976, the courts decided that issues of sexual harassment would also fall under this classification in Title VII. So if someone sexually harassed in the workplace, they could file a Title VII lawsuit. So you can see how that would open, the floodgates to a lot more legal opportunity, especially for women in the workplace at the time in the 70s and today. And then a more recent expansion actually is just this past year in 2020. The Supreme Court actually heard a case of discrimination in the workplace based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And they determined that these two classifications also fall under gender and sex under Title VII. So that means since that court decision in 2020, now, someone who believes they've been discriminated against because of their sexual orientation or because they identify as a gender other than their biological sex can now file a lawsuit under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So think of it as just basically this tent where we're kind of bringing in more groups of people to have coverage and protection under the law. And that's really what's happened since 1964, since the law has passed. Now, the 2020 case that I just mentioned is a really interesting one because, not only does it expand protection for these different groups, but it's also brought up a really interesting question in terms of sports. So I've shared a couple articles on ReggieNet for you to review because I think this is a topic that, while maybe controversial, is certainly one that's playing itself out as we speak in our court system and through our legislative body. So this kind of question about whether or not trans athletes should be able to participate in the sport of their chosen identity. And so a lot of people believe that because that Supreme Court decision determined that sexual orientation and gender identity are now included under Title VII, a lot of people think that that might open the door for other courts to view Title IX in the same way, right? So we know that Title IX also deals with gender discrimination just in education settings. So a lot of folks think that this is sort of an interesting precedent that might impact how courts now view Title IX in terms of that expanded protection. Like I said, I think this stuff is playing out as we speak, and there are kind of new legal cases every day involving, states creating bans for trans athletes, and then we also see the introduction of a federal bill in the House just this past year, where they're seeking to essentially limit Title IX protections to only biological sex. So that coupled with Joe Biden, who's now become president, him signing an executive order that says, gender discrimination is also going to include trans athletes. So it's a really interesting topic, one that, again, like I said, I think is going to continue to play out here over the next few years. So definitely interesting to keep your eye on, and certainly will impact what we do, I think, in K&R. Okay, so we've already identified that Title VII covers covers employment, right? So these are only lawsuits involving discrimination that occur in an employment setting, okay? Now, what's important to point out here is that we're not just talking about pay, like we were with the Equal Pay Act, for instance. Title VII covers all aspects of employment, so not just whether or not you're paying groups fairly, but it makes it much more broad in coverage and scope than, say, the Equal Pay Act. You can see here this list is sort of a laundry list of all the different things that are covered under Title VII. Right, so the actual hiring and firing process, of course, pay is included in there. You can see there are all these different issues where Title VII could come into play, right? The types of benefits you're offering, the type of training you're providing, mentorship, all of those things could be considered under Title VII. And even this last one that says other terms and conditions of employment, right? That's sort of a broad statement, but that means that essentially anything that occurs in the workplace in an employment setting could be grounds for a Title VII lawsuit if discrimination has occurred, right? Probably one of the most prominent examples of this is, again, that U.S. women's soccer lawsuit that they filed against the U.S. Soccer Federation. And I know we talked briefly about this in our gender equity unit, and we learned that, essentially a federal judge had thrown out the equal pay component of that lawsuit. But what I didn't get into in that unit is that the Title VII component of the case has actually been fairly successful for the women's team. They actually came to a settlement with U.S. Soccer over the conditions, their working conditions, and essentially the Federation admitted that basically they had been treating the women's team in a way that was lesser than they were treating the men's team in terms of just overall working conditions, in terms of their travel to games, in terms of their hotel accommodations, in terms of their medical services, training, et cetera, et cetera. So that Title VII portion of the case, the women were actually successful on, and they came to a settlement with the Federation and were actually able to get a lot of those things improved so that they're at a similar level in terms of the benefits they're getting to the men. So that's kind of an example of the successful piece of that lawsuit. And I'll go ahead and share this article on ReggieNet as well. Okay, so we're going to talk briefly now about the elements of a Title VII lawsuit. So you can see here that the burden of proof here is kind of on both parties in a Title VII lawsuit. It's got this sort of shifting framework in terms of application. So the burden of proof will start with the plaintiff, and the burden will be on them to prove that discrimination has occurred in an employment setting, right? And they'll have to point to one of these things that's on this list and provide evidence for how they've been discriminated against. After they've proven their case, which we'll look at those elements momentarily, the burden is then going to shift to the defendant in a similar way that it did when we looked at the Equal Pay Act. So we'll kind of break down what each side looks like in one of these cases now. Okay, so these are the elements that the plaintiff would have to prove in order to prove discrimination occurred under Title VII. Okay. The first is that discrimination that occurred is based on a protected class, right? So remember early on here in our video lecture, we mentioned that Title VII, while it initially covered racial discrimination, it was expanded to include these other classes over time, right? So in order to be successful in a Title VII case, you have to be able to prove that you exist in one of these groups, right? Discrimination is based on one of these classifications. If you can prove that, you can prove the first element, okay? Second element, this really refers to an instance where the person is applying for a job, right? So they have to be able to prove that they are, in fact, qualified for that job that they've applied for. Or let's say that if they're already an employee at that organization and they've been fired, for instance, that they were actually performing the job to a satisfactory level, right? Basically, in order to be successful, you have to be able to show that you are actually qualified or you are actually doing a good job. Then they have to be able to prove that they suffered some kind of adverse condition with respect to employment. So this could look like a lot of different things, right? This could be they did not get a job that they applied for. This could be that they were fired from a job that they already had. This could be that they did not receive a pay increase that other employees did. Some kind of adverse condition has occurred as a result of their employment, and they have to be able to prove that and show evidence of that. And then finally, in order to prove discrimination under Title VII, the plaintiff would have to show that others who are in a similar situation as them were treated more favorably, right? And basically, someone else who is similar to them was not discriminated against, right? Which creates the discrimination, right? So if it were, let's say, a female who's filing a lawsuit under Title VII, she would probably have to prove that someone else within that workplace similarly situated to her did not and was not subjected to the same treatment. So perhaps, she did not get a pay raise, but her male counterpart did, despite them having the same qualifications and the same satisfactory level of work, right? You have to be able to prove that someone else was actually provided different treatment. Otherwise, it's difficult to prove discrimination. Okay. So we mentioned that the burden then would shift back to the defendant to actually defend themselves. And in this case, more specifically, the defendant would have to show that basically the action that they took was for a non-discriminatory reason, right? So you can see here I say that the defendant's burden is one of production and not persuasion, right? So the truth is that in order to actually defend yourself in a Title VII case, you need to have evidence, right? You need to be able to show paperwork. You need to be able to show communication history. You need to actually be able to prove that the decisions that you make or the actions that you took were for a legitimate, non-discriminatory reason. And that can be tricky, but this is why it's particularly important to keep good records, right? Especially if you are in a management type position and you are involved in the hiring, firing process and all of that. So keeping good records can certainly help alleviate some of these issues or provide a good defense. Now, remember back to our conversation about the Equal Pay Act, we identified that there were certain viable defenses, right? So in an Equal Pay Act lawsuit, a defendant could prove that one of those defenses existed, and that was a justification for why they were paying, let's say, the male more than the female in the case. Well, those same defenses will apply in a Title VII case, but only if the case is based on pay, right? So if the case is based on a pay dispute, then those same defenses could apply. And most likely, if someone's bringing a Title VII lawsuit that's disputing pay, they're probably also bringing an equal pay lawsuit. And that's exactly what the U.S. women's soccer team did. Okay, so I'm going to pause there and let you watch the next two videos. The second one is going to focus on this issue of sexual harassment specifically, and then the third video will focus on the Age Discrimination Act.